just want to take this moment to remember those who lost their lives in the senseless shooting and violence this past week in Atlanta. Soon Chung Park, Hyun Jung Grant, Soon Cha Kim, Young Yu, Delana Ashley Yon, Paul Andre Michaels, Xiao Jie Tan, and Dao Yu Feng. I want to read their names because their names and faces, brothers and sisters, sons and daughters, real people who lost their lives. And in what's been a crazy year already, the pain of this moment. And I know as an Asian American myself, just a deep sadness, lament, anger that continues to arise, and confusion. And with the racial justice referendum that's really occurred over this past year, especially on behalf of our Black and brown brothers and sisters, the Asian story, I know it's easy to somehow get lost in that, but as the statistics kind of portray how much Asians have been targeted with hate and taunts. And there was one such person in our congregation who was attacked just a few weeks ago, and really bearing the brunt of this. We certainly renounce, and we grieve, and we lament, and we wonder, where is God in the midst of this? You know, and as the church, we're supposed to be at the forefront of all that is just and true and beautiful, and especially for the most vulnerable among us. And I just pray that we as a community could really embody that. You know, it's appropriate that we've actually been in this series in the book of Lamentations, because the book of Lamentations is basically an author is looking back at one of the most horrific seasons of the life of Israel. It's a time when they look back and they remember being plundered by the Babylonians and then being shipped off into exile. So losing their home, their center, their wealth, their sense of family, you know, and all of the graphic images that we've looked at over the past 5 weeks in these chapters have all been these depictions of horrific pain. You know, it talks about in passages, it talks about how kids are going hungry, that men are actually eating dirt because they are so hungry, that women are being violated. And so it's this kind of stunning portrayal of God's people, which is probably the most stunning thing, right? Like, how in the world does this happen to a people who trust you, God? And if you've ever been someone who's asked that question before, where is God in the midst of suffering? Well, this whole book of Lamentations is a book about suffering, and it actually doesn't quite give as many answers as perhaps you and I might want. In fact, what's so stunning about this whole chapter or this book and this final chapter is it actually ends in this very ominous way. So check out this passage. Look at how the book of Lamentations, this has been a lament looking back at just this poem of sadness and sorrow. And look what it says. It says, "You, Lord, reign forever. Your throne endures from generation to generation. Why do you always forget us? Why do you forsake us so long? Restore us to yourself, Lord, that we may return. Renew our days as of old, unless you have utterly rejected us and are angry with us beyond measure." Period. That's how it ends. It's not some fairy tale Disney story where everything comes together. There was this deep descent, but believe me, there was this climb, and you know, and everyone lives happily ever after. It actually doesn't end like that at all. It ends with this question: God, where in the world are you? Notice the words that are used. It's forget and forsake us. Now, it's interesting that these two words are the words that are used. And forget, it's almost like God kind of puts his hand away. Now, here's what we know about suffering and evil, that there is a part in theological terms, it's called the permissive will of God. There are things and evils and suffering that happen to people where we have no reason to understand why. It's the question, the very question that most philosophers throughout the ages have been wrestling with. Why is it that bad things happen to good people? Maybe you've even asked that question before. I know I have. And so right here, basically the author of Lamentations is saying, why do you forget us? Why do you permit in your permissive will for bad things to happen to seemingly good people? But not only that, it's why do you forsake us? It's not only about the permissive will of God. See, there's another kind of category of suffering and difficulty, which we've been exploring over the past few weeks, is how oftentimes is the result of bad decisions that we've made. So for instance, there's a suffering that I endure from eating too much fried chicken or whatever it might be, right? Like, because I love fried chicken. There's a suffering that comes to me as a result of my actions. Now, in the book of Lamentations, the way that God has been speaking about it, it's his wrath that is being poured out for poor decisions of exploiting the marginalized, of being an unjust kind of people. And so as a result, we realize that the wrath of God is actually a result of some of the bad and awful and sinful choices that people have made. And here in the book of Lamentations, it's basically saying, listen, the pain has been so voluminous and frequent. And it's come to this point where I don't know how much of it's because I deserve it, which I probably do. And I also don't know like how much of it is just you forgetting us. But either way, both of these things are true. We're suffering so much. You've both forgotten us and you've forsaken us, that you've rejected us and you're angry, or at least that's what it feels like. And so here's what we discover then when it comes to this. It basically means that sometimes when it comes to suffering and difficulty, and this is basically how the book of Lamentations ends. It's saying sometimes there are no answers. It doesn't end with kind of God giving this answer. Well, let me explain to you why. Let me tell you why this suffering. Let me tell you what you deserved. And let me tell you that which just kind of came out of nowhere. Instead, it's, the author is simply left with this question. Why this suffering? Why now? Why me? Why have you forgotten? Why have you forsaken us? Now, this is one of the most maddening things about faith, is that there are moments when waves of depression hit us, when there are no answers. There are moments when pain kind of comes in the form of racism or sexism, and there are no answers. There are moments when we lose people that we love, who are good people, kind people, and there are no answers. There are moments when we lose our babies or our children, or painful things happen to them, and there are no answers. There are moments when we just don't know what to say, and we wonder and we ask God and we say, God, why have you forgotten us? Why have you forsaken us? There are moments when global pandemics hit and there are no answers. Have you ever been there before? Have you ever been in a season where there are no answers? And what's so startling about this book of Lamentations, and I wish I could be here to be giving you a sermon like, guess what, guys, don't worry, it's going to end well. And yet, time and time again, even in the scriptures, you see even the people called by God, they end in these really painful situations. So for instance, King David is wrestling with kind of broken relationships in his family, and he's not able to actually build the temple. Moses, even because of mistakes he made in the wilderness, is not able to enter the promised land after enduring so much and freeing the people of Israel from captivity. He's not even able to see the promised land. It's interesting. It's not like we're unique in this story, the story where we endure suffering or difficulty and challenges and we have no answers. In fact, maybe more questions than answers. Have you ever been there before? I had mentioned a couple of weeks ago, there's actually one bright spot in the book of Lamentations, and it actually comes in chapter 3. And what's interesting about chapter 3, though, is that it talks about the Lord's faithfulness, that his covenant will endure. And it's almost like, remember, it's that small drop of water in the desert. It's that to avoid all or nothing thinking like this is all bad and it'll all go downhill. There's like just this little kind of reprieve, this moment where the author is reminding us of something like this little small little glimmer of hope. And here's what it says, right? It says, I've been deprived of peace. I've forgotten what prosperity is. So I say, my splendor is gone and all that I had hoped from the Lord. I remember my affliction and my wandering, the bitterness and the gall. I will remember them, and my soul is downcast within me. Now here's the churn that happens in chapter 3. Watch this. Yet this I call to mind. And that was really the title of the sermon 2 weeks ago. And therefore I have hope. Because of the Lord's great love, we are not consumed. For his compassions never fail. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. Do you catch the glimmer of hope? Do you catch it there? And he says, I say to myself, the Lord is my portion. Therefore, look at what it says. Therefore, I will rejoice. No, it doesn't say that. Therefore, I will wait for him. Go to the next passage. Look, it keeps coming up. The Lord is good to those whose hope is in him, to the one who seeks him. It is good to wait quietly for the salvation of the Lord. It is good for a man to bear the yoke while he is young. Let him sit alone in silence, for the Lord has laid it on him. Oh, isn't this crazy? Like this small reprieve that's given in chapter 3, and the one to do for all of us in the midst of the pain, of the sorrow, of the sadness, is not to rejoice and to have that all or nothing kind of perspective, is not to just get over it and be better. It's actually to wait. To wait. And I think here's what we discover about a life of suffering where there are no answers, a life where we're supposed to avoid all or nothing thinking, even when it's hard. Here's what we realize. Much of life is actually meeting God in the waiting. Oh, now here's what I know. As New Yorkers, I'm sure you hate to wait. I know that I hate waiting. I hate waiting for the train. And I hate waiting in line. I mean, well, if I go to the store, and I'm waiting in line, I'm usually like jittery, and I have to scan what the person is actually buying and how many products they have that they have to scan. And then I'll check if there's another line that I can run into, even though I'm halfway. Like I'll do this whole mental logic in my, why? Because I just hate waiting. I am an impatient person. I want things done, and I want them done now. And yet here's the antidote in the midst of like this pain. The exhortation for the people of God is to wait. To wait. To not have resolution. To live and to embrace all the grief, the sadness, the unknown, the lack of control. Oh, it's a killer. I mean, I want things to be done. I want to find out. I want to know. And yet, in the midst of the grief and the sadness, there's the invitation to wait. I was thinking about like an image that might be able to depict what waiting might feel like. The feeling of like things are unresolved and, in fact, painful. I was thinking of an image, and here's the image that I thought of. It's like hanging on a cross. And within me and within you and within all of us, there's this urge to want to get off that cross, to make things happen, to take things into our own hand. And yet the image that I thought of is the image of a Savior who just waits on a cross. He has all the power to defeat death and suffering and pain. Call down legions of angels from heaven. And he just hangs there, dying until his last breath. You know, what's interesting within kind of the Christian calendar and the scope of as we approach Holy Week is the weekend of Easter weekend. There's these 3 days, the day that Jesus dies, which is called Good Friday. Now, even though the idea of dying, you know, in Christian theology, it's the day that Jesus gave up sacrificially his life on behalf of us out of love for us. And then there's, of course, Easter Sunday, which is the day that we celebrate the resurrection, that Jesus is alive. But what's interesting is sandwiched in the middle between Good Friday and Easter Sunday is what the church historically has called Holy Saturday. And you know what's crazy is, can you imagine what Saturday must have been like? Like Jesus is dead. We saw him on a cross. We saw him gasping for air. And we saw all the hopes that we had in this Savior. His bloodied, bandaged body wrapped and put in a tomb with a stone over it. Can you imagine just how disorienting Saturday must have felt? All the people who wondered, who would put all their hopes and dreams into this Jesus. They had seen him do miracle after miracle. They'd seen him raise the dead. And yet all of that had come crushing down in this image of our Savior on a cross, died, crucified, and buried. And what's so startling is that the church, through its history, has called this day Holy Saturday. I mean, I would not call it Holy Saturday. I'd call it Awful Saturday. I'd call it like the worst, like dismal, hopeless, miserable Saturday. And yet the church has called it Holy Saturday. Now, there's a lot of reasons for that, and I won't get into them here. I just find that interesting. And as we talk about this idea of waiting, I wonder what Holy Saturday was like, this idea of waiting. You know, when it comes to this idea of waiting, I think of this quote by Shauna Nyquist in her book. And here's what she writes. She says, I've always essentially been waiting to become something else, waiting to be that person I always thought I was on the verge of becoming, waiting for that life I thought I would have had. In my head, I was always one step away. In high school, I was biding my time until I could become the college version of myself, the one my mind could see so clearly. In college, the post-college adult person was always looming in front of me, smarter, stronger, more organized. Then the married person, then the person I become when we have kids. For 20 years, literally, I've waited to become the thin version of myself because that's when life will really begin. And through all that waiting, here I am. My life is passing day by day, and I'm waiting for it to start. I'm waiting for that time, that person, that event when my life will finally begin. But this is what I'm finding in glimpses and flashes. This is it. This is it in the best possible way. That thing I'm waiting for, that adventure, that move, score, worthy experience unfolding gracefully. This is it. Normal daily life ticking by on our streets and sidewalks, in our houses and apartments, in our beds and at our dinner tables, in our dreams and prayers and fights and secrets and pain and suffering and sorrow and questions and racial strife and pain. This pedestrian, sometimes painful life is the most precious thing any of us will ever experience. I actually don't have many answers for us today other than sometimes there are no answers, and much of life is waiting for God or meeting God in the waiting. Some of you are like, oh, what's wrong with Drew? Like, why is he so quiet? Oh, did I mute something unexpectedly? I actually thought it'd be nice to just have an unplanned moment of silence in the midst of it all, because I know that in unplanned moments of silence, I get really anxious because I'm like, what's going on? Like, what's wrong with Drew? Do I need to fix this? What's next in the service? Is he going to pray? And it's kind of in moments like that where I'm reminded, like, sometimes life is confusing and disorienting, and sometimes I just need to sit still and wait and hope and pray that Easter is coming. I'd like to end with this psalm, which, as we talk about the book of Lamentations, the book of Psalms is full of laments. And one of the things that I love is psalms like this, where it's a prayer. It's a prayer to the Lord in the midst of turbulent times. And here's what it says. I waited patiently for the Lord. He turned to me and heard my cry. He lifted me out of the slimy pit, out of the mud and mire. He set my feet on a rock and gave me a firm place to stand.